And it's time for our Inkscape tutorial, and you know what that means. The first 517 customers who will call will receive an exclusive Welcome back to BodgedButWorks, and yes, we're actually doing an Inkscape beginners tutorial today. So you may ask, why make another Inkscape tutorial when there's already lots of them out there on YouTube? Well, in my opinion, most of them are for artists and not so much for engineers, so they don't explore the tools for making exact measurements in Inkscape as deep as I'd like. Also, they seem to be either long multi-part video series or just a 5 to 10 minute overview of what's basically possible in Inkscape. I started a quick poll on my YouTube page and got some positive responses from the community, so here we go. I suggest you follow along on your own computer. That way you'll have your Inkscape set up and your skills ready by the end of this video. I've got a lot of stuff that I'd like to show you, so I'll probably be dividing this tutorial into 2 videos. The first one is going to be a beginner's tutorial, so we're going to start with a clean Inkscape and make a cuttable file for the shaper origin. The second one will be an advanced tutorial where I'll be showing you how to work with files imported from other CAD software and how to automatically round corners, etc. Although this tutorial will be tailored to creating SVG designs for the shaper origin, most of the knowledge is applicable to other tools as well, such as CNC machines and laser cutters. For those of you who haven't heard of the shaper origin, it's a handheld CNC router with a camera to locate itself using these domino fiducials and a moving spindle to autocorrect your movements to the ideal cut path. It lets you cut giant designs while being super portable, and it's awesome. And I'm not being paid to say this, but as an engineer, I can't help myself. Let's get started in Inkscape. Inkscape is a software for creating and modifying scalable vector graphics. SVG is an image format that is different from the pixel-based image format that you're probably used to. Rather than saving many pixels with individual colors each, in an SVG file, you save points that then define triangles or circles or Bezier curves. For one, the image is a lot smaller when saved because you have to save much less data. And on the other hand, you can scale these images without them losing any resolution or getting these blurry pixelated edges. This is especially useful for CNC machining because the cut path is already defined in an SVG file and does not have to be extracted out of a pixel-based photograph. The basic workflow I'm going to show you in this beginner's tutorial is how to create a new design, then how to color it so that the shaper origin will detect cuts as outside or inside cuts or online cuts, and then how to export the file so the shaper origin will be able to read it. For more complex projects, you might not want to create the design directly in Inkscape, but rather import CAD files from softwares like CATIA or Autodesk Inventor. The advantage of this is that you can assemble the individual parts of your project in the 3D CAD software, and then, after you've checked that everything fits, export 2D views of everything and continue with the workflow in Inkscape that I'm going to show you today. The disadvantage is that it takes more time to get used to these softwares and that it's sometimes overkill to use a high-level CAD software for simpler projects. Now, let's go ahead and download Inkscape and focus on setting everything up correctly. Inkscape is free, so you can download it by visiting inkscape.org. I'll put a link into the description of this video. This is what Inkscape should look like the first time you open it. Now, before we dive in and I explain to you what all of these symbols mean, we're going to set up some settings by visiting Edit, Preferences. First, let's expand Input-Output and go to SVG Output. Here we want to check this checkbox, Inline Attributes. This will improve the compatibility of the exported SVG files with the shaper origin. Next, we're going to select Tools and switch from the visual bounding box to a geometric bounding box. This setting makes Inkscape ignore the width of outlines of shapes. So as you can see here, this black line is pretty large, and the dotted line here shows us the actual size of this shape. So I could say this shape is supposed to be 100 by 120 millimeters large, and Inkscape ignores the size of this stroke. So if I increase this here, the actual size does not change. And that's what we want for our CNC mill. Choose Behavior and set the simplification threshold to the lowest possible value. In my case, this is 0.0001. More on that later. Next, we'll go to Behavior, Transforms, and deselect Scale Stroke Width. This setting changes how Inkscape scales the outline of shapes. So I prefer that the outline always stays at the measurement I entered over here when I scale shapes. And if I select this checkbox, then as you can see, if I scale this down, then the line gets really thin. So I'm just going to deselect this. Let's go to Steps and change the inset-outset steps to 0.1 millimeters. Or if you're working in inches, then choose a lower value than the initial 1 inch or 1 millimeter in my case. With this value, we can change the behavior of the erode and dilate commands that I'm going to show you in the advanced tutorial. That's it for the settings in the Preferences dialog. Next, we're going to jump into File, Document Properties. This window pops up in the toolbar on the right here, but with right-click, move to New Window, you can undock it to have a bit more visibility of all the elements. The difference between the system preferences that we just edited and this document properties dialog is that you should always check the settings in the latter when you open SVG files that you did not make with Inkscape. Because SVG files exported from, for example, Affinity Designer or that you got from the internet might have a different scale setting and different document settings that might lead to the design that you want to cut in the right scale on the shaper origin being too large or too small. So always check these settings when you grab a file from someone else. The first important setting here is the display units up here. So you want to set this to either millimeters or inches. I think the default setting is pixels, and that's not a measurement that is very useful for CNC machining. So set this to something an engineer would use. The same goes for this units dialog on the bottom right here. So set this to, in my case, millimeters as well. Down here is the scale dialog, and right now it's set to 1, which has worked fine for me in the past. I have read in the forums that some people have problems when they import other SVG files and when they're working in inches. And this might be due to the fact that other editors assume a pixel density of 72 pixels per inch, but Inkscape works with a density of 96 pixels per inch. So if you import something and in your drawing space notice that a scale is off, then you might want to enter a scale of 72 in here rather than 96. Maybe that will fix the scaling issue with imports from other editors. The last thing that we are going to set up in this dialog is our grid. Switch to the Grids tab and click on New to define a new grid. Then I'm going to set my unit correctly and set the origin position to 0 and 0 and the spacing in both directions to 1 millimeter. I'm now going to talk about the toolbars and the icons that you can see in the control surface. Don't worry, we won't be exploring every individual one of them. I just want to show you the most important of them so you can get started with designing. By the way, in the bottom left, you can see what I'm doing with my F1 and F2 keys and the Control and the Shift key, which are used for like zooming or selecting multiple shapes. Up here are 2 different editing modes. One of them is for selecting entire shapes. So if I create a rectangle here, then with the Select and Transform editing mode that I can access by pressing F1, I can select this entire shape, move it around, rescale it. And by clicking on this symbol, I can activate the Edit Paths by Nodes option. And in this mode, I can edit the individual anchor points of, for example, this Bezier curve. So I can drag them around, change their strength, and so on. If you are having problems selecting anything and you're thinking, why isn't this working the way I'm used to, you should probably press F1 and then you're back to the standard selection mode for the more macroscopic operations on your shapes. Right below we have some shape primitives such as rectangles and circles. With the Bezier curve editing tool, I can either create polygons, or if I click and drag, create these Bezier rounded anchor points. Then there's this text tool that you can use to add text in different styles to your designs. And at the very bottom there's a ruler that we can use to measure angles and distances inside our designs. The most important icons in this top toolbar are these quick transformations that I can use to horizontally or vertically flip a design and rotate by 90 degrees. Then to the right there are some options to change our object hierarchy. So for example, I want this ellipse to be below this rectangle, then I can move the ellipse downwards and there we go. And last but not least, these 4 dialog boxes that change the position and the size of your shapes. So if I want this rectangle to be exactly 60 millimeters wide and 10 millimeters high, then this is where I would do that. In the toolbar on the far right, you will find options to change how things snap. The topmost icon turns snapping on or off globally, and with the options below, you can change more specific ways of snapping. You can hover over them to get a tooltip. To give you an example, if I turn on snapping to object middle point, then if I grab this ellipse, then you can see I get this X symbol in the middle and it starts snapping to our grid positions. I could turn snapping to the grid off down here, and now it no longer snaps to the grid. So if I grab it here, you can see it moves freely, but it will snap to the center points of other shapes because this center point option is still on. I could turn on snapping to paths. Remember, I still have the center point snapping on, so now the center point will snap to this curve over here. And of course you can also set this to the edges or the corners. It gives you a lot of control to just drag shapes together and build the shape that you want to have by changing the snapping modes over here. If you want to override the snapping, you can hold the Shift key while dragging a shape around. The Control and Shift keys are also really useful when creating new shapes. To give you an example, if I select the Ellipse tool and now start holding the Control key, then I am able to make a nice circle and don't have to kind of guess when it's a circle. So the Control key lets us maintain the scale on both axes, and the Shift key will let us draw around the center. So if I press Shift and Control at the same time, I can create a perfect circle around the point that I selected at first. So Control, Shift, like that. Same goes for rectangles. As you can see on the top here, my width and height are exactly the same. I'll now select the standard selection mode with F1. And using that, I can just click on shapes and rescale those shapes by either dragging the corners or the edges. If I click on an already selected shape again, then I am able to either shear or rotate this shape. You can check how much you've rotated already by watching the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. By holding the Control key while rotating, you can snap in angular increments. So in my case, 15 degrees. By double-clicking shapes, you can unlock special features. For this ellipse, I can turn it into a kind of pie chart. And for the square, I'm going to press F1 to return to my standard selection mode and double-click on this rectangle. I can round the corners. You can also set the rounding magnitude with the dialog box up here. So I could say 5 millimeters. And now I have myself a nice 5 millimeter rounding over here. You can change the behavior of this double-click editing mode by choosing one of the options in the top toolbar. So if, for example, I want to get back to my original ellipse, I could choose this option. I'm going to undo this by pressing Ctrl Z. Now if I double-click again, I can change the mode to this one if this is the effect that I want to achieve with my shape. So this gives you additional flexibility to get from primitive shapes such as circles and rectangles to some more complex stuff. Now let me show you how to modify the individual vertices of our curve here. I'm going to press F1 to go into the standard selection mode, select our curve. And the first thing I want to do is to get it above this rectangle. So I'm going to select Raise Selection to top. And now if I zoom in by holding the Control key and moving my mouse wheel, I can press F2. And now you can see the individual vertices have diamonds or squares on top of them. So I can click and drag them. And of course, they also will snap to our grid locations. Some of them aren't corners like this one, but more like a smooth point inside our curve. And those have these handles. As you can see, if I change the length of this handle without changing the angle, just the length, I can change how this node interacts with this part of the curve. Now I can change the way these handles behave by control clicking on this node. Observe how the symbol changes. So now it's a circle. I can change this to a square. And after that I get a diamond. And these are different editing modes, because right now in the diamond one I can move these handles independently. But this will also result in kind of a sharp turn here, so it might not be what you want. To get out of this mode back into the smooth editing mode, if you will, I'm just going to control click and I'm back to the square symbol. So now the blue handles are connected again. This is super useful for cleaning up SVGs that you downloaded from the internet or that you converted into SVG from a photograph, because those sometimes have jagged edges, and that's often because these nodes are in the diamond editing mode and the Bezier curve isn't quite smooth but has these corners. And it's usually not what you want when you're cutting with the Shaper Origin or a CNC mill. You want kind of a smooth edge that your cutting bit can follow. So keep in mind, you can always change vertices from corners to smooth ones by control clicking on them. One last thing I want to mention concerning this curve is that this is quite obviously an open shape. So the Shaper Origin will not be able to distinguish an outside and an inside of this shape. The only thing you're going to be able to do is to cut on the line. With the circle, for example, you could define an outside cut, so your milling bit, which I will simulate, will run around the shape, like so. That would be an outside cut, or inside the shape, like so. But you can't do that with this Bezier curve because it is not closed. Of course, this example is pretty obvious, but sometimes you might run into a problem where you create a design, load it up in your Shaper Origin, and you will wonder why it isn't giving you the option for an inside or an outside cut. And it may be that when you zoom in, you notice that a path isn't quite closed, something like this, for example. Now, of course, these are two individual paths, so that's the next problem. But just to show you, if you have something like this, the shape isn't closed, and that might be the root of the problem that you can't do outside and inside cuts. So keep that in mind when designing. Try to use the primitives, and if that's not possible and you're working with Bezier curves, then always make sure you click on your initial point at the end so that the shape is closed. Another way to check if your shape is actually closed is to confirm if you can give it a fill color. I'll get to this color menu in a short bit, but if it's not possible to fill your shape, then it's quite probably not closed. I'd like to quickly talk about a few tools that make engineering and designing with exact measurements easier in Inkscape. The first one is guidelines. At the edges of my drawing space, there are these rulers with these small triangles that follow my mouse. And if I click and drag these rulers, then I am able to create horizontal, vertical, and diagonal guidelines. I can move these guidelines around and snap them to certain positions, or I can double click on these red dots, which is the origin of a guideline, and set a position, for example, 250 millimeters downwards from our document origin, which is located on the top left of our page here. So the X direction, the positive X direction is to the right, positive Y direction is downwards. This line is now where I need it to be, and I can now, for example, in the right toolbar, deselect snapping to grid. So now my shapes will no longer snap to the grid, but they will snap to this guideline here. Let me disable the rounded corner. And as you can see, it snaps to this guideline now and ignores the grid unless I turn the snapping back on. The ruler, which we talked about in the beginning, is another neat tool. Note that it also snaps. So I could, for example, if I turn the grid snapping back off, I could measure the distance between the two corners of this rectangle because the ruler snaps to the corners. Or I could turn on snapping to the object midpoint and now measure this. So if you just set up your snapping correctly, the ruler can be extremely powerful and help you position holes that you want to drill in parts or some cutouts, whatever you need. You can simply use the snapping, guidelines and the ruler to get the position that you want. You can also enter the position for this shape in these top dialog boxes, although those are relative to the top left corner. So I could set this top left corner to 112 millimeters in X direction and whatever, 270 millimeters in Y. And there we go. But sometimes it's just easier to use the snapping with the grid, the guidelines and the ruler to achieve exactly the layout that you want to cut. To access the transform menu, we're going to choose Object in the top toolbar and click on Transform. In the toolbox on the right, you can see we have a new menu now, and there's a few different tabs: Move, Scale, Rotate, and so on. To give you an example what this can do, I can select my shape by pressing F1 and selecting it. And we can rotate it like this, but that's kind of hazy, and even if I click and hold Control, I can only use these increments. So what I can do is to set a precise angle, for example 17.4 degrees, choose a direction, and then if I click on Apply down here, I can apply this transformation to this shape. Same goes for moving. If I, for example, want to move this shape by an exact amount and don't want to use the dialog boxes, or my grid, for example, is set to a 5 millimeter spacing, but I want to move it by 7 millimeters, then this is where I would do this, or in this case, -7 to move it to the left. Let's stay in our right toolbox and click on the Objects tab. In this list, you can see all of the shapes that we've drawn so far. The one that appears on top here will also be on top of the others geometrically in the design. So if I move this over this ellipse, then as you can see, it's covered. And if I select a shape in our drawing window here, it's also selected in our list. So I could select this ellipse here and move it above our rectangle in the list. And now, as you can see, I've changed the order. This is going to be useful later on when we've colored the shapes and we don't want the larger ones to cover the smaller ones, because now I can't even see where the circle is and I can't select it. So keep an eye on that list order over here. It's also pretty useful if you have many different shapes or many individual ones. If you want to select multiple shapes, you could do this by pressing and holding the Shift key. But if there's a lot of shapes, this can become quite tedious, so it's easier to select them here in the list. You can also select the first one, press and hold the Shift key, select the last one, and then you get a group selection. And if I now move them to the bottom of this list, then as you can see, they're all in the back now, and I can only select them by drawing a rectangle, and only if I know they're there, so maybe not the best idea in this scenario. By using specific colors for your fill and your outline, you can encode how the shaper origin is going to cut this shape. So an outside or an inside cut, an online cut, a pocketing cut, or no cut at all, just a guideline in your design to be able to align everything properly. Shaper has a coloring guide on their website, which I'm going to link to in the description. But I've also got it here. So as you can see, there's certain presets. If you create a shape with a white fill and a black outline, then that means an interior cut. So your cutter is going to move on the inside. With this encoding, it's an outside cut, and so on. In the fill and stroke menu, you have subtabs for the fill, which is the inside color of your shape. The stroke, which is the outline. I'll zoom in because it's hard to see. And the stroke style. So I could make this thicker or something. Because we've set the geometric bounding box at the very beginning, it doesn't matter how thick your stroke is. So you can make this as thick as you want. It's just for visual reference, so you don't have to pay attention to that. It's just important what color it has. So if I make this a white fill with a black stroke, then we get our interior cut. If you want to make sure that the color is 100% correct, because sometimes if you do this too quickly, then you might drag your mouse against one of these edges and then it's not really black, it's kind of reddish black. You can always check this with the color code down here. For a white color, it's supposed to look like this. All characters are in F, and for black, 6 zeros and then 2 Fs. So if you kind of do something weird, then you'll always see it'll be a non-black or white code. For the gray and the blue styles, the shaper origin is pretty tolerant, so you just have to make sure it isn't white or black. Just pick anything in between. So some shade of gray is fine, that'll work. To make a guideline that won't be cut, but is just there for visual reference, just choose a blue that you like, or very blue in my case, but it basically doesn't matter if it's not perfectly blue. The shaper origin will recognize it anyway. And for our outer rectangle, to make this an outside cut, we have to set the fill to black and the stroke to black as well. This is why the hierarchy in the list, the objects list, is so important, because with these like pure black and white shapes, it's really easy to oversee the inner rectangle if it's not positioned correctly. So I usually try to move the outline cut, which is usually the largest shape in my design, to the very bottom in this list by just dragging it, or by setting it to the very bottom here in the top toolbar, and then it'll be behind everything in Inkscape. At some point, you'll probably want to add text to one of your designs. Making text in Inkscape is pretty simple. You just use the text command and write some letters. The thing is, you can't just cut this text, so if you export this file, then it won't be cuttable on the shaper origin, and that's because we haven't converted it to a path yet. Doing that is pretty straightforward, so I'll select my text by pressing F1 and then choosing Path, Object to Path. The difference is now, if I press F2, I can see the individual nodes and drag them around and even modify the style of my text. You have to keep in mind that now it's no longer possible to edit the text in the classical way. So what I'd suggest, I'm pressing Ctrl Z to go back, make a backup copy of your text. So Ctrl C, Ctrl V, move that out of the way real quick. Now I'm gonna grab the original and convert it to a path. So I can now no longer double click edit that text. This one is my cuttable path now with the nodes. And this other one is still an Inkscape text object that I can edit. I can color this with a blue fill and no stroke. And now it's a guideline basically, so the shaper origin will probably display it anyway, but it won't cut it. And this is the one you're going to be cutting. Now I can color this path text to whatever cut type I like. So for example, remove the stroke and make it gray. And by the color definition, this is now a pocketing cut to recess this text into my workpiece. One last exciting design feature is the custom anchor that was introduced to shaper origin with the recent Inverness update. And if you want to read up on what that feature does, I'll leave a link in the description. For our design, that means we have to create a red triangle. So I'm going to turn my help grid snapping back on, zoom in a bit. I'm just gonna select this point, this one, and make sure the shape is closed. The important things to consider with this triangle are that it has one 90-degree angle down here, and that the two sides that are not the hypotenuse differ in length. So we have a short one and a long one. And now all we need to do is to color this triangle red and remove the stroke. Ta-da, that's our custom anchor. And if I have my snapping set up correctly, then I can just grab this bottom left corner and snap it to whatever point of interest I'd like to in my design. After you've finished your design and double check that all of your stroke and fill colors are correct, it's time to save. I'm just going to quickly declutter this design. What I like to do before saving is to select all of the shapes in my design by pressing Ctrl A, and then either choosing Edit, Resize Page to Selection, or pressing Ctrl Shift R. And as you can see, this changes the size of our page to the relevant shapes in our design. The shaper origin does not care about the size of this page. This is just aesthetic in Inkscape. It just cares about our shapes and draws its own rectangular bounding box around the shapes, which is why the custom anchor can be extremely useful sometimes if you don't want to position your design at the corners of that automatic bounding box that the shaper origin draws around all of the shapes in your design. Now I can choose File, Save, or press Ctrl S. And the important thing here is to choose plain SVG from this list. So not Inkscape SVG, but just a plain SVG. That will also improve the compatibility of your file to the shaper origin. And there you go. Congratulations, you just exported your first cuttable SVG file for shaper origin. I hope you were able to follow along with this tutorial and are now able to creatively design whatever you'd like in Inkscape. If there's anything I explained too quickly or not detailed enough, then please write it in the comments and I'll try my best to answer all questions you may have in the comment section. This concludes the beginner's part of my Inkscape tutorial. If you want to learn some advanced features such as modifying files that you imported from other CAD software or automatically rounding all of the corners in your designs, then stay tuned for the next video. Thank you for watching and have fun designing. See you soon. Bye.